Good morning. Welcome to our online worship service for Kitsap Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. I invite you to follow along with the order of service. The link to it will be in the chat. Whoever you are and wherever you have come from, or whatever your comfort with technology, for this hour, we here are one gathered congregation and all are welcome. My name is Catherine Woods. I currently serve on the Worship Committee and the Media and Communications Committee, and I'm glad to be your lay leader this morning. Our worship leader this morning is the Reverend Carol McKinley. She's a regular guest speaker here at KUUF and an affiliated community minister with the Olympia UU congregation. I'd like to welcome any visitors. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We welcome more interaction with all during our after-service Zoom coffee hour. The link for our coffee hour will go into the chat next. You will also need to use the password WOMEN with a capital W to join the coffee hour. If you are phoning in today, welcome. If you want to join the coffee hour by phone, the number to call is 1-253-215-8782. The meeting ID is 438-451-134, and the password is 8533-2070. The announcements are on our webpage at kuuf.org or in our weekly email newsletter, The Candle. And now we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we all live is the Aboriginal territory of the Suquamish, the Sklallam, and the Skokomish people. They have lived in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea for thousands of years. These tribes still live here and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. Now, please join in our call to worship, hymn number 1028, The Fire of Commitment, performed by Elena Hemingway and Brian Kenny.
From the light of days remembered, burns a beacon Harriet Tubman, known as the General on the Underground Railroad, leading people from slavery in the southern United States, wrote, "Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars, to change the world." And if you have a chalice or a candle at home, let us light our chalices together with these words. That we may remember, that we may know, that we may imagine and touch our dreams. Let us kindle our true light from the fire of our souls. And now, let us join in singing our opening hymn, number 1014.
Please join me in the spoken affirmation, which will appear on the screen. We gather as a caring community, seeking life's deeper meanings. We value diversity and affirm the worth of all living things. We strive to speak truth in love, to act for justice, to grow in spirit, and to care for the earth. We celebrate with open hearts and minds the creative power that sustains and transforms us. And now it is time for our morning offering. If you would like to donate electronically, please click on the paypal.me link in the chat box. You may then email admin@kuuf.org to let us know if your donation is for the KUUF General Fund, the Minister's Discretionary Fund to help our members in need, or our monthly charitable giving recipient for the month of July, the Bremerton Food Line. You may also send a check to the address on the screen. Please write in the memo line which fund you would like to send your donation to. If this is your first time at KUUF, you are our guest and there is no need to contribute. Let there be an offering to strengthen and sustain our community, which is sacred to so many of us.
Good morning. Glad to be here again, and I have my granddaughter Zoe to help me with the story.
Hi.
Thank you, Zoe.
Yeah.
Today's story is about an impossible friendship formed in 1849 between Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. It was a powerful friendship. Should we begin?
Yeah. Two friends.
By Dean Robbins.
A horse pulled a creaky buggy down Madison Street in Rochester, New York. Susan B. Anthony set out 2 saucers, 2 cups, and 2 slices of cake.
Frederick Douglass arrived for tea. Susan lit 2 candles on the table. 2 friends sat by the fireplace in Susan's parlor. Frederick wore a gentleman's jacket, vest, and tie.
Susan wore a type of pants called bloomers. She liked them better than the heavy dresses women were supposed to wear. Those dresses made it hard to get things done, and Susan had many things to do.
As a girl, Susan wanted to learn what boys learned, but her teachers wouldn't let her. They said girls didn't need to learn important subjects. They should grow up and raise children, and that was all. Susan's mother couldn't vote or own a house or go to college. Few women could.
Susan wanted something more. She read about rights in the United States, the right to be free, the right to vote. Some people had rights while others had none. Why shouldn't she have them?
Susan taught herself to give speeches. Some people liked her ideas about rights for women.
But others did not.
The candles glowed in the parlor. Frederick sipped his tea. Susan asked him about his newspaper. He filled it with his own ideas about rights. Everyone's talking about the new issue, he said. Frederick grew up as a slave in the South. Slaves had to do everything the master said.
But Frederick wanted more. He secretly learned to read and write. New ideas thrilled him. Frederick read about rights in the United States, the right to live free, the right to vote. Some people had rights while others had none. Why shouldn't he have them too?
Frederick escaped his master and headed north. He taught himself to give speeches. Some people liked his ideas.
But others did not. Susan liked Frederick's ideas, and he liked hers.
He moved to Rochester, and they promised to help each other so one day all people could have rights.
The fire crackled. Susan and Frederick ate their cake and talked about their plan.
So many speeches to give.
So many articles to write.
So many minds to change.
They would get right to work.
As soon as they finished their tea. I can picture them sitting there, can't you?
Yeah, I'm plotting to change the world.
It's a really powerful story.
It's an epic story.
Thank you, Zoe.
Yeah.
We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
So let's sing our song, This Little Light of Mine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All around the universe. All around the universe, I'm gonna let it shine. All around the universe, I'm gonna let it shine. All around the universe, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Even when I'm home. Even when I'm home, I'm gonna let it shine. Even when I'm home, I'm gonna let it shine. Even when I'm home, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Thank you all for singing. Thank you for singing with us.
And now is the time for joys and sorrows. Though we are physically distanced from one another, our hearts and spirits remain connected. When shared together, our joys are amplified and our sorrows lessened. If you have a joy or sorrow to share, I invite you to put it in the chat this morning. Joe Walter has gratitude that Claire is recovering remarkably well from her emergency surgery. She's also grateful that the head injury from her mom's most recent fall resulted in only 7 stitches and nothing more serious. Thank you for sharing, Joe. Joey has a joy to share that his dog Beast is settling in well and is starting to relax and play. We're so happy for you, Joey. Genevieve and Nathan Emmett have a joy from Morgan to share, that last night he got to have a sleepover with grandmother. Kathleen is joyful that they had such a wonderful visit from their granddaughter Zoe this summer. And we're so glad she could join in the children's story. Thank you, Kathleen. Bonner has continued gratitude for the Zoom platform. Thank you all for sharing. May those of you who shared this morning feel the love of this community surrounding you and holding you close. And for all those whose joy or sorrow is too tender to share, our hearts are with you. May the spirit of life and love bring peace to us all. Amen and blessed be. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed by the Senate in 1919 and ratified by the states on August 19, 1920. Next month, we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of its passage. It reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex."
Malala Yousafzai, a 23-year-old Pakistani woman, became the youngest Nobel Peace Prize recipient in history in 2014 for her advocacy for education of women and girls in Pakistan, even in the face of attempts on her life by the Taliban. Pakistan has named her the most prominent citizen of the country. She writes, "I raise up my voice, not so that I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard. We cannot all succeed when half of us are held back. I raise up my voice, not so that I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard. We cannot all succeed when half of us are held back." Now let us be together for a moment of reflection. In 1776, as men gathered in Philadelphia to declare the colony's independence from England, Abigail asked her husband, "John, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." Well, during the 144 years between Abigail Adams' request and the opening of voting booths to most women, work towards suffrage would parallel efforts of other groups to achieve the same right. And this is a struggle that continues today. The suffrage movement did not emerge out of nowhere. It had roots in activism to abolish slavery, and many early suffragists recognized the interconnection between work for abolition and for women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, from her childhood, was keenly aware she did not have the same rights as the men in her family. She had read law with her husband or with her father, a judge, but she could not practice law because she was a woman. A devout non-believer, she studied the Bible, then wrote the Women's Bible to criticize the treatment of women in the Old Testament. In 1840, Stanton attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London with her friend Lucretia Mott, who was an outspoken Quaker abolitionist. And there, at that meeting, it became very clear to Stanton that women and abolitionists shared a common goal: the recognition of each person's full humanity. She returned home, began working on what became the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And in that document, she called on the government to grant female citizens all the rights and privileges granted white male citizens, and for moral, economic, and political equality for women. In July of 1848, she presented that declaration to the first Seneca Falls Convention in New York. And it came out of that convention signed by 68 women and 32 men. And the declaration marked the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. Now, the Declaration's first male supporter was that man we heard about in the children's story, Frederick Douglass, that former slave. And he supported women's right to vote as well as other rights accorded to most men: the right to higher education, to a professional life, to the ownership of property, to obtain a divorce. In short, he advocated for women to have the right to have a say in one's own life. Now, African American women had been agitating for political rights since the 1830s, 20 years before, and created the interracial female anti-slavery societies in New York and Philadelphia. And these were radical expressions of political ideas that led directly to voting rights activism before and after the Civil War by Black women. Now, during Reconstruction, white women's rights activists who had worked for abolition disagreed about whether to support the 15th Amendment, which provided voting rights regardless of race, but did not explicitly enfranchise women. And at that point, Black women, who had become increasingly marginalized, split from the white-led, predominantly middle-class suffrage movement and directed their suffrage movement through the National Association of Colored Women, which by the early 1900s became a powerful political bloc. And we'll hear more about them later. Now, struggles for equality demand that traditions and entrenched beliefs, first of all, must be recognized, then challenged, and then dismantled. underlying systems that supported the gender and racial status quo were very familiar to those early suffrage leaders. Lucretia Mott reminded women, any great change must expect opposition because it shakes the very foundations of privilege. And of course, that foundation was not easily shaken. In the mid-1800s, it was generally believed by both men and women that the proper sphere of womanhood was the home, and women did not need to vote because nothing beyond their doorsteps was of concern to them. So instead of engaging in public affairs, women were expected to manage households, raise their children, and entertain company. Now, although many women felt that was their proper place, others believed that women needed the right to vote, primarily to protect those homes and families from the world's vice and corruption. They saw themselves as moral housekeepers called to speak out against slavery, prostitution, gambling, and of course, the evils of alcohol. The Women's Christian Temperance Union worked with the suffragists in many ways. My grandmother in Eastern Washington was an enthusiastic member of the CTU, which saw women as a moral force to protect women and children from those evils brought on by alcohol. The WCTUers sang hymns and prayed in saloons, lobbied for temperance reform. A favorite guerrilla tactic of those women was charging into a saloon and smashing the bottles behind the bar. Naturally, saloon owners and the patrons retaliated, arguing that voting could actually be hazardous to the moral health of women. They pointed out that many polling places were often set up in pool halls and saloons, which were unsuitable for women. And in those pool halls and saloons, alcohol flowed freely on election day, and that was usually provided by candidates. Well, the times, they were a-changin', and women wanted their voices heard in all spheres of American life, as scholars, doctors, even ministers. The Universalist and suffragist Olympia Brown, the first woman to graduate from a theological school and be ordained in 1863 by a denomination, lived during the campaign for suffrage to vote in 1920. She reflected, "The grandest thing in my life has been the lifting up of the gates and the opening of the doors to women, giving liberty to 27 million women, opening to them a new and larger life and a higher ideal." Now, here in the West, women were often seen as equal partners. After all, it was hard labor to work a homestead or a farm. So in 1869, while we were still a territory, the legislature approved the country's first community property law, giving women joint legal ownership of any property purchased by themselves or their husbands after marriage. So for people here in Washington, you might say the passage of that law led to unintended consequences, because by strengthening the legal status of Washington women, the groundwork was laid for suffrage. Now, over the years, women had been allowed to vote on certain issues, such as local school district elections. And in 1893, women alone were invited to vote for the state flower as part of Washington's display at the Chicago Columbian Exposition. There was a very lively campaign. Many suggestions included the four-leaf clover, the fleur-de-lis, dogwood, syringa, the wild rose, the Marguerite daisy, and Oregon grape. But as we know, the rhododendron won with 7,700 women's votes. But the serious work toward a national constitutional amendment to ensure women's suffrage continued, but it was not easy. Women who attempted to assert their political identities were openly criticized, and ridicule was used freely and often. When a suffrage leader attempted to vote in 1869, newspapers denounced her, saying a woman should unsex herself by dabbling in the filthy pool of politics. One suffrage worker said, "I was looked upon as a fanatic, and the idea of a woman voting was regarded as absurd." But here in Washington, work for women's suffrage did not stop. That famous national advocate, Susan B. Anthony, made a speaking tour to the Pacific Northwest in 1871 and inspired the local Women's Suffrage Association to forcefully lobby in the legislature for women's right to vote. Well, the fake news of that day sought to undermine the efforts of Anthony and the suffragists. Reports that Anthony had accepted a glass of wine from a bartender in Umatilla, Oregon, convinced Walla Walla church leaders to cancel invitations to speak in their churches. The regional newspapers stepped up the attacks, describing Anthony as a most horribly ugly old maid, and denounced her as an infidel who supported free love. But the Washington suffragists remained undaunted. We Washingtonians can be proud of our state's role in the long struggle for women's suffrage. After the National American Women's Suffrage Association met in Portland, Oregon, the Washington women stepped up their efforts here. Two very different women were key in the work to pass a suffrage amendment in the state legislature: May Arkwright Hutton and Emma Smith DeVoe. Now, Hutton was a former boarding house proprietor in the rough and tumble silver mining town of Kellogg, Idaho, who with her husband made a fortune in a silver mine. She was brash and opinionated. She believed to be effective, efforts needed to be forceful and less polite. The more discreet DeVoe worked hard to maintain a low-key, ladylike, but persistent presence so as not to incite any opposition. Now, despite their great differences, the two women worked together. They were determined. And in 1910, Washington's suffrage law passed the legislature. It was the first statewide law in the nation. Well, the victory here in Washington state revitalized the lagging suffrage movement across the country. So it was time to go national. Alice Paul, who was the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, was a veteran of the suffrage demonstrations in England. In fact, she had been arrested during protests there. But she returned home with new understanding of the power and symbolism of public protest, especially at the seat of power. And that meant Washington, D.C., where the newly elected Woodrow Wilson was to be inaugurated March 4th, 1913. Now, Wilson, although he had campaigned as a progressive reformer, did not bring those qualities to his position on women's suffrage. He had opposed it in his home state of New Jersey. His inauguration, Alice Paul thought, was the perfect opportunity for a parade, a women's march, when thousands would be gathered in the Capitol for Wilson's inauguration. Applying tactics that she learned from the more militant British women, Paul created a media blitz with lots of press releases about the parade. Photographs were beginning to be used widely in periodicals and newspapers, and Paul made sure the campaign provided a lot of them. So the day before the inauguration, more than 8,000 women from all over the country wearing white stepped off on Washington, D.C.'s Pennsylvania Avenue. The parade was choreographed to be highly photogenic and was led by a costumed woman human rights lawyer astride a white horse, followed by bands, mounted brigades, and floats. The marchers were organized by states and professions, including university women, homemakers, librarians, and nurses, all wearing that symbolic white garb. That march was the first big national march that brought demands of the people to the United States Capitol, and it became the model for subsequent demonstrations in the Capitol. And we were to see Alice Paul's strategy repeated on the eve of another inauguration. We saw it in the Women's March on January 21st, 2017. And that march happened not just in Washington, D.C., but in cities around the world. Now, Black women's expectations that they would hold an equal place in the parade were dashed when Alice Paul, succumbing to pressure from the other white middle-class organizers, were concerned about the image. So Paul asked Mary Church Terrell, who was leader of the powerful African-American women's group, and her contingent to march not with their state's contingent, but at the back of the parade. And that's when the prominent Black civil rights activist and suffragist Ida B. Wells ran to the front to join the Illinois delegation. The parade began. Protesters jeered and attacked marchers, and the police failed to intervene. Later, Senate investigations denounced the treatment of the marchers and of women who later picketed the White House. And news coverage kept the women's cause in the media spotlight for months. And of course, support for the women's cause grew. Even President Wilson was converted after seeing the contributions of women to the war effort, which we had entered in 1918. So he endorsed women's suffrage. The 19th Amendment, introduced in Congress, ultimately passed in 1919 there, and as we heard in the earlier reading, was ratified by the last state, August 19th, 1920. So we are celebrating 100 years of women suffrage. In the mid-1800s, Sojourner Truth observed, if women want any rights more than they've got, why don't they just take them and not be talking about it? Eleanor Smeal, founder of today's Feminist Majority Foundation and past president of the National Organization for Women, echoes Sojourner Truth's sentiment. She says, we were not given the vote, we took it. Well, the 19th Amendment was not an end, but a beginning. It would take 4 more years for many Native Americans even to be considered citizens with voting rights. For some Asian Americans, it would take even longer. And many Black women, while possessing suffrage on paper, could not freely exercise that right until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act barred racial discrimination voting practices such as literacy tests. And as we know, efforts to block Black voters and other voters of color at the polls continues. The early suffragist determination eventually overcame the opposition and scorn of those who tried to uphold entrenched systems that controlled women's lives. And those women did not work alone. They needed allies, other women, of course, and the men who controlled the social and political systems that held the power to change the systems. And like all of those who work for transformation, they developed creative ways, took advantage of flashpoints that ultimately changed hearts and minds. Those flashpoints, a parade, the sight of peaceful marchers turned back with fire hoses and dogs captured on a television camera, the murder of a Black man recorded on a cell phone. Those flashpoints caused and continue to cause the world to shift as pressure overwhelms resistance to new ways of being. What seemed impossible becomes inevitable. Women, people of color, LGBTQ people, factory workers, immigrants are keeping pressure on oppressive systems that make any person less than fully human. And we see the impossible become the inevitable. And so may it be.
I invite you now to set an intention for the week to come. You can choose 1 word, 2 words, or even 3 words. If you feel called to, please put them in the chat and I will read them aloud now. Judy Arbogast says, encourage voting. The primary is August 4th. Ed Woods, from Nancy Woods, or Nancy Slate, my apologies, compassion. From Joe Walter, persistence. Bonner, continue fighting the good fight. Beth Wilson shares, care for all. Rachel McBain shares, oh, from Diane, be true to myself. Thank you for sharing your intentions. Please join in singing our closing hymn, number 1015, I Know I Can, performed by Mike Menifee, Elena Hemingway, and Brian Kenny.
troubles may wait there at every turn.
Still
I know,
yes, I know,
I know
I can go on. My sister,
my sister,
my sister
she's
in my heart.
oh, my brother right here in my soul. Although troubles may wait there at every turn,
Still I
know,
yes, I know I
can go on. Although the journey is long, so long, I see.
Still I see that destination
Yes, it's clear. Those troubles may wait me at every turn.
but I know,
I know,
yes, I know
I can go on. So brother,
come and take my hand. And sisters, help me sing my song. For I know hope it awaits me at every turn. And I know, yes, I know we will go on.
That's one of my favorite hymns. You could probably hear me singing along a part of that. As we extinguish this chalice, we do so with these words. In this time of changes and transitions, let us imagine what we can be and how we will be. May our work be grounded in that which is eternal: love, faith, hope, the urge toward justice. May we welcome that which is new, for it is in that very newness that we find possibilities, potential for that which is yet to be. Amen. And let us go in peace. And I hope you will join us for the coffee hour. The link is in the chat. And remember to use the password women with a capital W.